Okay, thank you. So this first webinar during this workshop today is about spreadsheets in nanosafety research. And the reason to focus on spreadsheets is that they are just used a lot. There is quite reasonable support for that. Spreadsheets at the same time are only one means of disseminating knowledge. There are other data formats the ways we think about the knowledge in these spreadsheets is actually in common with those other formats as well. So what we will see in this, the use of spreadsheets in nanosafety research is underlying patterns that apply to other things as well. So my name is Egon Willegrage. I'm a researcher at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. In the middle of the slide, you'll find my author identifier, the ORCID, and my Twitter account. You also find just below that the hashtag nanocommons. And if you like to tweet about this presentation, these slides, if you want to share screenshots of these slides on Twitter, please do. You're most kindly invited to do so. These slides are CC BY, and when we start with the practical later on, I will share in the chat window the link to Zenodo, where you can download the slides themselves, so you can look at it later and reshare it with other interested people. But please do tweet about the meeting. Use that also to on social medias to talk about this workshop. What do you liked about it or did not like about it? Let us know. It's communication. So towards the spreadsheet. So what is a spreadsheet? Well, in the context of this presentation, for me, a spreadsheet is what is given here. So a spreadsheet is not the same thing as Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel is just one of the tools. A spreadsheet is a bit more general. Wikipedia describes it as a spreadsheet is a computer application for organization, analysis, and storage of data in a tabular form. The spreadsheet actually indeed has a lot of computational tools. You can have macros in there, functions to summarize data, but obviously just for exchange of data, the storage of data, this tabular form is also very much used. We can also look at the ontology term for spreadsheets, and then we see that the National Cancer Institute, the SAURUS, actually has a definition for it as well, quite similar to the one given by Wikipedia, and they describe it as a document that organizes data in rows and columns. So that definition excludes, for example, the data analysis part that many spreadsheet tools also allow. I also added there in the middle this link. I'm wondering if no, that doesn't do. So that the thing that starts with HTTP NCI CB there, that is the machine readable identifier for this ontology term, and that is something that we'll see come back later on. So now we have a definition, and we can actually identify uniquely with this web link here. This term, so that we can be precise about what a spreadsheet is. If we decide it's the second ontology term rather than the Wikipedia definition, if we like that definition enough. So what tools do we have to handle spreadsheets? Microsoft Excel is one. Google Spreadsheet, LibreOffice or OpenOffice, if you like, also has a spreadsheet program that's called Calc. But we also see spreadsheets shared as comma-separated values or tab-separated values. They're not identical. The latter two actually really focus on one table, whereas a spreadsheet actually can be more complex, and we'll see that in a second. So what does a spreadsheet actually visually look like? Well, something like this. This spreadsheet here is a simpler version of a real-world spreadsheet that we see later on. And we see this tabular organization of data here. We have rows and columns. The rows have the data, except for the top row, which has the descriptions of what the various columns are like. So column A, for example, has labels for Well, what we assume is nanomaterials. The label is, yeah, it's like a name. We can reasonably assume it reflects the chemical composition of the nanomaterial. We see that it's a nanomaterial because there is some size information given. There is some additional information here, like zeta potential. There's some biological information like cell viability after a certain exposure time here on a number of, well, what we can assume to be cell lines. And column G in the end actually has a literature reference, which might, for example, reflect where that data came from, which actually in this case is true, because this spreadsheet actually comes from an article that describes it in more detail. But it also shows immediately a problem with spreadsheets like this. So in column B, we have size, for example, but it doesn't specify really how the size was measured. There's no protocol linked to it. We don't even know if it's a DLS or a TEM size or a hydrophobic particle size, or there's no shape information. So yeah, we can only assume its diameter at this moment or so. So that indicates a major limitation of spreadsheets. They have only a limited amount of space to explain things. Now the example that I gave on the previous slide actually comes from this article. This is a paper from last year, a meta-analysis of nanoparticle cytotoxicity with a lot of data extracted from literature. So that explains that last column with literature references. And this article actually, as you can see here in the mid-right side, it has supporting information. And the supporting information from this article actually looked like this. It looked like this spreadsheet. And we see a similar design to what we saw in the previous slide. We see a lot of tabular data, though with more columns, and it actually goes beyond column K, and a bit more detail, but yeah, still not that much. At least we can see here that the size indeed is diameter. We see a column C with a lot of black boxes. So the materials in row 2 to 25 do not have any coating. So we get some extra information. You can also see why that zeta potentials are not always given in literature. Now, I already mentioned that these spreadsheets, they have some limitations, and these should be really, really important to remember. And we have the problem of meaning and a few more. So I'm introducing a few mistakes that we can make with the use of Excel spreadsheets. We can work around those mistakes. We can solve that, and it's things to be aware of. I hope that many of you have seen this article. More recently, actually, they did a more detailed analysis of the impact of this thing. But this is real. This is real, and there's a lot of downstream reuse of data where this goes wrong. Gene names that get mistakenly identified by Excel as dates. And so that's where the data exchange in the spreadsheets get mixed with analysis. So Excel tries to be helpful there. It tries to analyze the data, and it sees something that looks like a date, but it actually is a gene. And it starts changing that. It analyzes the data. It does something because the spreadsheet did not actually tell Excel that those values were actually gene names and not dates. This is one of the figures from that article, and we see the problem here. So in column A, for example, we see the names of the genes. We immediately, even if we look at that, yeah, those pretty much look like dates. This is exactly what Excel does as well. So it converts it to an internal data format and then visualize it in a default date format. And then we have a couple of more examples here in column E through G and I through K. Unfortunately, there are a lot of genes with names that look like dates, and this is a real problem. And this information propagates and ends up, for example, in the NCBI databases, as we can see in this figure from the same article, where the date actually is shown rather than the original gene name, the label representation of the gene rather than the original. So more recently, they actually studied on how many supplementary information in peer-reviewed literature is suffering from this date problem, and the number of articles that had such issues were shockingly high. Now, it doesn't mean that the conclusions of those articles are immediately wrong, because the spreadsheet may not be the way they analyze the data, but any downstream further analysis will have that problem, as we can see here, for example. So what is another problem with spreadsheets? And here is basically the point of not having enough columns. I could not find last night a better example, but undoubtedly we will see a number of them today because they're quite common. It's a situation where the tabular structure combines information into one cell. So, for example, the value and the unit of some experimental data, unlike what we saw earlier with, for example, the unit normalized for the whole column, the size all in nanometers, or in the better example at the bottom of this slide, where the unit even is given in a separate column, in column 11 at this case. So the value here in column 13 and the associated standard deviation or error in column 14 is linked to the unit in column 11. Even that we have to guess a bit because the columns are not clearly linked together in this example. This is what we see very often. Data can better be split up in multiple columns, which is a bit more work, but it makes the downstream use a lot easier. This also happens, for example, when the size information from nanoparticles is sometimes an average, sometimes a min-max range, or sometimes an average with an error. These problems are more prominent if you look at literature, because there is no standardization in literature on how to report these things, but you might actually recognize that from your own research as well. Another thing is that what we saw already in the difference in definition of spreadsheets is that while they both refer to tabular data, a spreadsheet does not actually require that. And I took this image from an example spreadsheet from Wikipedia to demonstrate that, because very often spreadsheets have not this well-structured thing as we saw in some of the examples, but something like this. So in the bottom right of this spreadsheet, we have a small table. We have something that looks like a combination of a table and some summaries on the left bottom. We have some other information there. Well, if I pass this to a computer and to statistical software, for example, and I say, well, this spreadsheet has the data, it first needs quite a bit of cleanup. For example, us telling the data analysis scripts or tools where the actual data is and what information can be ignored from this spreadsheet. So data not being rectangular, but actually consisting of multiple rectangulars with a lot of additional metadata around it, as in this example. Not unlike a rectangular matrix that looks like this. So this is the same example that we saw earlier, but what we also said, well, we don't really know what type of size this is. We have cells and we have something that's probably L929 cell line and the PC3 cell line, but we may not be entirely sure. on top of that, we actually might want to specify a bit more about the cell line that we actually really used in this experiment, which is the cell line that you have in your fridge, which originates from these cell lines at some point, but probably has been in use for some time in your system as well. So here, with linking the meaning to meaning in your spreadsheet, is finding a balance between what do we want to communicate, what do we want to tell with about our data in this spreadsheet, and at what level of detail do we want to express this. So is an exposure time of 24 hours, is that good enough? Or do we actually want to report there? Well, okay, because of practical things, I had to go to the bathroom. It's actually 24.5 hours of exposure, something that is quite normal and which is quite acceptable, etc. So adding meaning and MV, what does that stand for? Can we link that to an ontology term so that the computer also understands that? Which for MV and for NM and for H is still pretty obvious, but generally this is less so the case. Now a few more slides, and then I'll stop. So one of the platforms that try to address these problems is ISATAB. So the TAB here stands for tab separated values, so TSV files, but this tabular structure of data. And they identified that actually it's quite hard to do everything in a single table. So that's where the ISA comes in. The I stands for investigation, the S stands for study, and the A stands for assays. And so if we describe an experiment, we actually need a description of the investigation being done, which studies were involved in that, and for each studies, which assays were used there. And for each of all those assays, that results into a tabular data file where we have our experimental data. That could be files of several kinds. And the ISA part, that is part of the spreadsheet where we have this. Now, one of the things that the nanosafety community realized was that the physical chemical characterization of these nanoparticles is an essential part of what you want to document before you actually link to the experimental data. So in the United States, they worked on ISATAB Nano, which adds a fourth layer to this ISA standard, describing the materials, and that is a fourth type of tabular tables that describe these things. And this picture is from the article as given in the bottom right, describing the ISATAB Nano standard. Here we can see one of the interesting aspects of ISATAB itself is that it has a way of linking the content of the spreadsheet to ontology terms. And that is what we see here in the middle table, for example. So we see that material type, nanoparticle, sample, and dendrimer, they're linked to ontology terms. Now, I would not be the first to say that I would be able to read these files without actually carefully thinking about them, because looking at these things, I have to look up things. So what is MPO_1404? I do not know that by heart. But at least, as we can see in column L here in the middle, we know this is from the nanoparticle ontology, so I can look up what that term is and I can start making sense of it. And with that, we have a very important point of why this annotation of these spreadsheets is important. Because if we look at the spreadsheet like this makes sense. We know what PC3 is, it makes sense now. But what we want to achieve in dissemination of knowledge, the same reason why we cite prior literature in our articles, is that we want to give the reader of our article, of our research output, to be able to learn the things that they need to know to make sense, to follow the argumentation of your research. So we need a way to learn what PC3 is, and that's where ontology annotation comes in. We link it to further information. We cite a description, a definition of that term, so that the user of your data can learn what your data is about. So how is this being used in the nanosafety cluster? So here, for example, we have the Joint Research Center in the NanoRec project that developed a number of those spreadsheet-like tables. Those were published a couple of years ago. I don't have the date here. At the end of the NanoRec thing. As the second paragraph indicates here, sharing logic is ISATAB Nano. So these spreadsheets, they all follow the principles of ISATAB, though are not always formally specific for it. These are not the only templates existing in a nanosafety cluster. More recently, Gracious made an extension to introduce a few more Excel spreadsheets. Excel templates, as they're called here, but they're just regular spreadsheets. You can you're not required to use Excel for these templates. But also templates, for example, from IOM in the UK, which have a different design, different idea, but the same approach: structuring, making the information more tabular. So what can we do about this ontology annotation, about that mistake, about annotating these with the links? So we saw already how ISATAB does that, but it basically comes down to the use of ontology annotations. So linking some concept you have in your spreadsheet to a definition of that, and so using the ontology identifier, which normally is an internationalized resource identifier, an IRI, as given at the bottom here, that is a unique identifier for that ontology term. And with that identifier, you can look up the information and see what the description is. This case is a very short description. We see actually that a titanium dioxide nanoparticle here is actually an inorganic nanoparticle, and the ontology provides context and description of what that information is. And depending on the ontology, you get more or less information. Now, the last slide, and I realize that the presentation is taking a bit longer than I had in mind, is if we have a spreadsheet, we can formalize that with ISATAB to indicate what is what in that spreadsheet, but we can also do that differently. And this was done by ID Consult, one of the parties in Nanomaper, and they developed a tool, NM Data Parser, for this purpose. And these are being used actually for the JOC templates, for example, to read that data into FAIR databases like the Nanomaper platform, which is also, for example, also hosted by ECHA in their observatory. And this tool too uses annotation of the content of a spreadsheet, and that annotation is quite cryptic. There's quite a bit of a learning curve in identifying that. But what that JSON data file on the right there indicates is the detailed information indicating that this row, this size row, is actually a pristine particle size. We might even link it to protocols being used here. So this JSON file allows you to indicate what is your content of your spreadsheet. The reason why I bring up this, because this NM Data Parser is not something that we have time to look at today, but it's one of the solutions. But the point here is that while spreadsheets have their limitations, they are quite common. We can do a lot with them, and making your data available in the first place is a lot more important than doing it perfectly. So in that sense, if spreadsheets are for you the way to share data, please continue doing so. It's much more important to make it findable, which we'll look at after the lunch break, and share your data than the format. That said, we're going to look at a couple of technologies that we can do to make it easier for people looking at those spreadsheets to understand what you're trying to tell them. Okay, that ends the this presentation.